Welcome back to the bio session. Today we are going to discuss about reproduction in flowering plants. As we know, the flower is the reproductive structure of the plant. Look at this diagram. It contains the reproductive organs. Many plants have flowers which contain both the male and female reproductive organs. In this diagram, it is clearly shown stamen, reproductive organ, pistil or carpel, female reproductive organ. First of all, we will look at male reproductive organ, stamen. It consists of two parts, anther and filaments. Look at the diagram. The anther look like a sac-like structure involved in producing and storing the pollens. You can see a long, slender thread-like structure, that is the filament. Its main function is to support anther. Now, look at this diagram. This is female reproductive organ, that is called a carpel or pistil. It consists of three parts: stigma, style and ovary. Stigma is the topmost part. Style is the long tube that connects stigma and the ovary. Ovary is the ductless reproductive gland that contains lot of ovules. In this part, the seed formation takes place. Look at this diagram. Stigma, stamen, petal, sepal. Now we are going to check what is petal, sepal. Petal, the parts of a flower that are often colored. Sepal, it is a small, tough, leaf-like structure. The sepals form a ring. That ring is called a calyx. During the bud condition, the petals are covered by a green leaf that is called a sepal. Sepal forms calyx. Look at the diagram of the rose flower. It is very clearly shown what is sepal and what is calyx. Petals are found in plants that use insects to pollinate their flowers. They are large and colorful part of the flower. Some petals produce scent and the scent attract insects to the flower. The petals form a ring called the corolla. The petals in the corolla may form a circle or a tube. Now, pollination. Pollination is the act of transferring pollen grains from the male anther of a flower to the female stigma. This is possible in the same flower and between two flowers. Look at the diagram. If the anther, that is anther contains pollens, this pollens transferred to the same flower, then it is called a self-pollination. If it is happened in two different flowers, then it is called a cross-pollination. Types of pollination. There are two types of pollination: self-pollination and cross-pollination. Pollination that occurs, that takes place within the same flower, then it is called a self-pollination. If pollination that takes place between two different flowers of a same species, then it is said to be cross-pollination. There are different pollinating agents are there. Look at the slide. There are two pollinating agents mentioned. One is wind and the other one is insect. So based on that, you can divide flowers into two: insect pollinated flowers and wind pollinated flowers. The main difference comparison between insect pollinated and wind pollinated. In the case of insect pollinated, the petals are large and brightly colored because they want to attract insects. But in the case of wind pollination, they are small, maybe dull colored because they don't want to attract insects. In the case of insect pollinated plants, the plants or flowers, they produce nectar to attract insects, but in the case of wind pollinated, there is no nectar produced. Insect pollinated plants, moderate amount of pollens produced, but in the case of wind, large amount of pollens produced. Insect pollinated plants, the pollen grains are sticky or spiky because they want to attach to the insects. But in the case of wind pollinated, they are smooth and light because they want to carry from one place to another by the wind. And thus inside the flower, stiff and firmly attached. But in the case of wind pollinated, it is outside the flower. Stigma, in the case of insected pollinated flowers, it is inside the flower. But in the case of wind pollinated, it is outside. This is the comparison between insect pollinated and wind pollinated flowers. Now, bees and flowers. Look at the diagram. The pollen grains, the pollens are there. The scent from a flower producing the nectar that travels through the air. It may stimulate the receptor cells of a honeybee and the insect flies towards it. As it gets closer, the bee also uses its eyes to find the flower. Its eyes are highly sensitive to ultraviolet. This makes some of the pale markings that we see normal light to stand more distinctly, and it helps the bee to identify the flower. This is called a honey guides, and it directs the bee towards the nectar. After landing on the flower, the bee sticks its head between the stamens and the probes the nectary with its mouth parts. While taking up the nectar, it brushes past the anthers and pollen collects on the hairs of its back. When the bee has collected the nectar, it flies on to the next flower and feeds again. Some of the pollen on its back passes on to the stigma of the next flower. The bee has stiff hairs on its front legs. Periodically, it runs them through its body hair like a comb. This action collects the pollen of the bee's back and it's stored in the structure called a pollen basket, which are made from hairs on its back legs. The action of enzymes and the addition of other substances change the nectar into the another form, that is honey. Look at this slide. Pollen from the stamen stick to the pollinator's body. That means that in this case, in the honeybee, and it collects flower from the nectar. Then it carries to the another flower. When it reaches to the another flower stigma, the pollen is deposited there and it reaches to the ovary. Unusual methods of pollination. Look at the diagram. Most plants either have flowers that are pollinated by insects during the day or have wind pollinated flowers. But there are some unusual methods of pollination found in many parts of the world. Some of the example, the first one, the bird of paradise flower has stamens that form perches for birds. They pick up the pollen on their feet. Next one. The flowers of the century plant contain large amounts of nectar for bats to drink. Each bat carries away the pollen on the fur on its head and neck. Next one. Honeysuckle flowers produce nectar at night to attract moths to pollinate them. The cuckoo pint has male and female flowers on a short stem covered by a hood. The plant releases an unpleasant smell to attract small flies which enter the hood, pushing through the downward pointing hairs. As they pass over the female flowers, the stigmas collect pollens from the insects. The hairs prevent the insects from living for a few days. During this time, the male flowers make pollen. When they release it, the hairs wither so that the insects can crawl over the male flowers. It pick up the pollen and escape to take it other cuckoo pint plant. Now, Canadian pondweed. It produces male and female flowers on long stalks which led them to reach the water surface. The male flower releases pollen onto the water and it floats away. Some of this pollen reaches the female flowers and the pollination occurs. Rafflesia. It is a parasitic plant normally that lives on the roots of vine in Malaysian rainforest. It produces the largest non-flower of any plant, that is around 91 centimeter across. It is sometimes called a stinging corpse lily because the smell of rotting meat and it produced to attract flies. There are separate male and female flowers and the flies they attract bring about pollination. Now we are going to check another topic, that is fertilization. After the pollen grain has reached the surface of a stigma, it breaks open and forms a pollen tube. Look at the diagram. The male gamete cell that has traveled in the pollen grain moves down this tube. The pollen tube grows down through the stigma and the style into the ovary. In the ovary are ovules, each containing a female gamete, that is cell. When the tip of a pollen tube reaches an ovule, the male gamete enters the ovule. It fuses with the female gamete in a process, and that process is called a fertilization, and a cell is called zygote is produced. This is the process that takes place in fertilization. Now, after fertilization, what happens? The zygote formed during the fertilization process and it divides many times to produce a group of cells which form a tiny plant. Structures that later become the root and shoot are developed and a food store is laid down. While these changes are taking place inside the ovule, the outer part of the ovule is forming a tough coat. When the changes are complete, the ovule has become a seed. As the seeds are forming, other changes are taking place. The petals and stamens fall away. The sepals usually fall away too, but sometimes, as in the normal case of tomato plant, they may stay in a place. The stigma and style wither and the ovary changes into fruit. Look at this diagram. After pollination, the seed that turns to the fruit, then that seed germinating, seedling will form, then a new plant will develop. Thanks to watch.